Hello, everybody. I'm very excited that I'm able to host this degrowth talk this day or evening, depending where you are. I'm very excited we have this opportunity. We are all connecting from different time zones and areas. Personally, I'm currently east of Istanbul and north of St. Petersburg, and both my mobile phone and my router are connected to a car battery. So I really hope that it will all work. One of our speakers unfortunately also had some connection problems, but we are happy that he will be online later. So we have a range of 4 speakers for you today, practitioners and academics working on the topic of nature conservation, which partly in what they're doing is linked to degrowth, because this is a topic which within the degrowth movement unfortunately hasn't been discussed very much. So we have had a lot of engagement with environmental justice and how we would like to improve living conditions for humans, clean air, clean water, less polluting industries, and so on. But we less often have asked ourselves as conservationists how the degrowth movement and how a degrowth world could look like for non-human nature. So I would like to encourage all of you to keep putting your questions in the chat, because we're collecting them and we will put them forward to the speakers later. Each speakers will have 10 minutes to start with. Then after that, we will have just add all the questions which you have. I'm very happy that we have 90 minutes to talk. But if there are a lot of questions, we are also willing to extend a little bit more. So use the opportunity that we have these speakers here to chat with us on this topic. So the first person who I can introduce this evening is Iago Otero, and he got a PhD in environmental sciences from the Autonomous University in Barcelona, which most of you know is a big hub for degrowth movement. But he is currently working as a coordinator of the Interdisciplinary Centre for Mountain Research at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, as well as a freelance researcher. So his research deals with a number of different topics related to sustainability, like adaptation to wildfire risk, biodiversity conservation, social-ecological transformation, and interdisciplinarity. As an activist, he has been mostly working in landscape management initiatives to build resilience to wildfire in the Mediterranean. And also recently, he has published a paper on policy analysis in biodiversity regarding the topic of the connection of biodiversity and growth. So he will present us his research. Thank you.
So good evening to all of you. I hope you are very well, and I hope you can all hear me well. Otherwise, please, the moderator can drop me a line in the chat. A big thank you to the organizers for inviting me today. It is my turn to start with a short overview of the connection between economic growth and biodiversity loss. For this, I will present very briefly the main findings of a paper entitled Biodiversity Policy Beyond Economic Growth that Carola just mentioned right now, which you will find also open access in the page of the event. First of all, what is economic growth? So in this paper, we understand it as an increase in the production and consumption of goods and services, generally measured as GDP, gross domestic product, which is the market value of all the goods and services produced in a country within a certain period of time, okay? And what is biodiversity? It is the variability among living organisms, as well as the ecosystems they belong to. It can include diversity within species, among species, and among ecosystems. It can be genetic or of external appearance, and it also includes the distribution of this variability in time and in space. So the connection between economic growth and biodiversity loss can be understood by this very simple figure that I will share now. So growth increases the use of resources as well as the trade, which in turn trigger a set of mechanisms of biodiversity loss, which you can see here are land use change, climate change, and the expansion of invasive species. Land use change includes different processes like the expansion of agriculture, the expansion of cities and of infrastructures. These changes are well correlated with GDP, and they threaten biodiversity because they colonize the natural habitats where this diversity exists, okay? Climate change, as you know, is produced by an increase, a human increase in the greenhouse gas emissions. And according to the IPCC, GDP growth is an increasingly important driver of this. And on the one hand, warming is happening very fast and many species are just not able to adapt. And on the other hand, climate change increases extreme events, which are also detrimental to biodiversity. The third mechanism of biodiversity loss triggered by economic growth is the expansion of alien species, which are species that are not native to a region, that are introduced by human activities, and later they can expand by themselves, entering into competition with the native biodiversity. There is a very clear link between trade, international trade, and the expansion of invasive species, because obviously trade provides opportunities and facilitates the transport of these species to new regions. So economic growth is related to biodiversity loss very clearly so far. So then a logic question is, could an economy grow while at the same time reduce its impacts? This possibility, as probably some of you know, is called decoupling, and there are two types. Relative decoupling means that GDP grows faster than the impacts, which also grow. It has happened at the global scale, as well as in many countries in the last decades, for example, for measures of material use, appropriation of vegetation, and also CO2 emissions. The other type of decoupling is absolute decoupling, which means that GDP grows while the impacts decline in absolute terms. Is this happening? Well, yes, there are some examples of this. Industrialized countries had declining CO2 emissions between 2006 and 2016, as well as declining biodiversity impacts between 2000 and 2011, despite continued economic growth. And this is accounting for the effects of resource consumption and trade outside of their borders, okay? Now, are these trends fast and wide enough to ensure global sustainability? Clearly not. And can global and fast enough absolute decoupling happen in the short-term future? We don't know. We don't have the capacity to see the future, but all data reviewed in the paper make us think that, make us be quite skeptical about this possibility. Now, how is economic growth and decoupling seen by international policies on biodiversity and sustainability? We did an analysis of this for a selection of policies ranging from 1972 to 2016. And we found that there is an advocacy of growth in the most important policy documents, like, for example, the Brundtland Report from 1987, or the declaration of the UN Conference on Environment and Development that was held in Rio in Brazil in 1992. Only a minority of the policy documents that we analyzed acknowledge that economic growth is problematic for biodiversity. More than half of these documents just ignore the question of decoupling and how decoupling might be achieved. And among those that do address this question of decoupling, only some of them accept that decoupling is really challenging. And this is the case, for example, of the Global Biodiversity Outlook number 4, which is a global report on biodiversity that you might want to take a look at. Then in the paper, finally, we propose some concrete alternatives. First of all, we select 7 policy proposals from the growth studies and discuss their potential to stop biodiversity loss and how they could be implemented at different scales. These policies include some of the well-known policy proposals from these studies, like, for example, caps to the amount of resources that countries can trade, moratoria on resource extraction in the sensitive, biodiverse sensitive regions, limits to large infrastructures, work sharing schemes, support to agroecology, promotion of compact urban planning, and finally a control of the advertising of harmful products. And then we also suggest 2 immediate steps. First, we propose that the conflict between growth and biodiversity is acknowledged in new policies and reports, especially at the international level, which is the focus of the work that we did. And a significant step in this direction is the IPBES Global Assessment of 2019. For those of you who don't know, the IPBES is an intergovernmental body established by states to favor the dialogue between biodiversity research and policy. It is the equivalent of the IPCC for biodiversity and ecosystem services. And the global assessment that was published last year acknowledges the need to move away from the paradigm of growth. And this is a significant step, I think, because among other things, it was approved by consensus of all the different member states, something that would have not been possible 10 or 15 years ago, according to the review of policies that we did in the paper. And second, we propose that IPBES incorporates a scenario beyond economic growth in the new biodiversity scenarios that is currently developing. Okay, these scenarios use something called SSP, which stands for Shared Socio-Economic Pathways, and are the descriptions of alternative societal trajectories in terms of the economy, of institutions, etc. And these descriptions are coupled to models of environmental and climate change. And to show this proposal, I will now share the screen again. I hope you can see well. So currently the SSPs or the scenarios that are available are SSP 1 to 5, which you can see in this picture. They all consider positive growth rates and they have different outcomes in terms of biodiversity. So what we suggest is to add a new one that we call SSP 0, that you can see here in the middle along the y-axis, which we called Beyond Economic Growth, to examine low and negative growth pathways that are compatible with strong biodiversity and well-being targets. We illustrate how this SSP0 could look like, and also we provide some examples of different indicators and how they could be combined, especially to explore the contribution of biodiversity to well-being and also the ways economic growth affects this contribution. So in a nutshell, the idea that we are launching in this joint paper is to open up the range of biodiversity policies, and through the IPBES and other modeling and scenario development efforts, be able to help countries prioritize biodiversity and well-being over economic growth. So that's all from my side. Thank you very much, and I'm very much looking forward to the other speakers and to your questions and the discussion.
Thank you very much, Iago, for this introduction and showing your recent research. The next speaker I would like to introduce is Tonny Nawshin. She is a climate justice activist and a degrowther currently based in Berlin. She is involved in the German climate movement since 2017. In her talks, she mainly focuses on colonial continuity, climate crisis, and racism. Tonny grew up in Bangladesh and has been mobilizing to save the world's largest mangrove forest, the Sundarbans, since 2016. She's a graduate of economics and is working with a German NGO researching fossil finance. Tonny, I'm really excited that you will tell us your perspective on the connections of the degrowth movement and practical protection of biodiversity on the ground.
Thank you, Carola. So this topic, first of all, of course, when Carola approached me with this, I am not a conservationist, or that's how I don't think of myself as such a way. But one of the reasons why I wanted to pick up on this, or what I thought I could bring into the table, is, so my presentation is not going to be like a formal academic presentation. It's going to be kind of like a political rant as well, bringing in all the different perspectives of my identity. So kind of, I see myself as a degrowth activist. I'm a climate justice activist, and also I've been mobilizing. So I studied economics, the mainstream, very new classical economics. So of course, growth is the epitome of all the reason why we study and what we do. So and from there, having studied that and kind of arriving at degrowth, and also being involved with this movement in Bangladesh, where we all know, kind of in a country with a lot of challenges in terms of population, in terms of per capita, very low per capita income, and then a large amount of, so we are one of the highly densely populated countries in the world. Within that, we have a lot of challenges in terms of 80% of our population lives below the poverty line of $2 a day. So within all of that, when we also started this campaign to protect the forest, the Sundarbans, to give you a context, the movement was, the government of Bangladesh decided to start building coal power plants near this forest, and also a lot of industrial work around it, like cement and other factories. So when all of this happens and comes with a lot of course, economic growth and a lot of job opportunities. So from the movement side, when we were protesting that, we of course ended up coming to this deadlock of environment versus development discussion. This is what we had to fight. So I come kind of having all of these different experiences and understanding of the situation. So then I thought I would like to rather bring in that perspective. So it's going to be, again, like a political kind of an rant for myself. So I would just to organize a bit. So having given you this background of where I come from, kind of, or the thoughts or the hats that I change or put. So I would first start from the idea of, as I said, like I'm not a conservationist. So in terms of within the degrowth idea, as already Iago shared a bit. So fundamentally, when as a human economy, as a size, when we talk about growth, it cannot be so that the space we take up on the earth, that basically means that we at the same time marginalize, we put everyone, everything else, all the other living organism in the planet to the side. And although, I mean, of course, within the decoupling discussion, there's also some discussions that it is not probably just a little bit of decoupling that we see is as a result of the increased efficiency and, of course, the non-material production in the countries, or the countries that are not involved with the manufacturing and primary production of economics could only experience decoupling. As a global economy, if we consider all the countries together, it's never possible to really achieve decoupling. And also, of course, then it's never possible that we can preserve the biodiversity on this planet without reducing our human size. So if that is the first point, so if it's as the core for degrowth, then how do we approach? So that literally then I put that forward. So as a degrowth, we basically believe that we need to reduce our size and live in harmony with the ecology and the planet where we are. And then comes the second of the second box that I want to open. Then it comes this, how do we see conservation? Then is there, or how do we tackle with this whole human need, or this need of growth? We need growth because there are still so many people, humans on this planet, who do not have enough to eat, to live, education. And when this is the case, how isn't it very insensitive of us, or very romantic or privileged of us to say, oh, but we want to protect some animals, or we want to protect some forest where our fellow humans are not. We are not even being able to provide enough for our fellow humans. So this is kind of also the discussion, as I was saying, like we needed to unpack when we were on the ground, we were discussing with the government or fighting the government policies. So here also at the core is the reason why we cannot provide enough for our fellow humans is not necessarily lack of growth. It is fundamentally the economic system, or the how we distribute our production is faulty. So at the core, it's not that we need to consume everything else, and it's not necessary that we have to provide for the humans at the cost of all the other species and nature. So, and this is actually why this system, the way we are organizing, is the reason we are marginalizing other human beings in this system, as well as other species. And when we look into it that way, then the third point that I want to now unpack is that we see that somehow through this system, what we have done is the marginalized human communities are now in some certain parts in conflict with this marginalized nature, which was actually my primary motivation wanting to participate in this talk, because there were, I don't know, maybe many of you know it, there has been certain incidents that caught my attention. That in India, there was this one case where was a pregnant elephant that came to the village area, and then she ate a pineapple, and apparently that pineapple, I'm sorry, this is going to be a bit triggering, it's not a nice incident. So the pineapple had some firecrackers that the villagers put to protect their crops. And of course, because the elephant took it and she died, it's a very difficult event. And what happened eventually afterwards, what I saw in a lot of the social media, there were people who were angry and who were demanding justice for this elephant, at the same time, of course, saying, oh, these villagers must be punished. And there isn't, because there isn't enough strong legal system executing humans who are doing cruelty to animals, this can carry on. And this was where also I was thinking that, but we are lacking this structural understanding or analysis of the system, where how are we putting, so that it's never some rich people who are in conflict with elephants. It's always these poor villagers who are living in the marginalized communities in the outskirts, are having to fight for resources sometimes, and creating, it somehow is being even in this conflict between nature and humans. And then there are this cruelty, and there are also different forms of cruelty that we see are reproduced by humans on animals. And there it's also often this lack of resource. So fundamentally, what I wanted to reflect on is this, why the people who do not have enough resources, who are already marginalized within their societies and their economic system, they have been exposed to a certain cruelty all the time, and then within their world they end up reproducing that to someone, this in this case the elephants or the dolphins or this nature that is relatively weaker than them. So at this cycle of reproduction of cruelty or marginalization, what we are seeing is this whole big conflict where there are different front lines, but at the same time, when we are discussing conservation or how we carry out as a whole society, I wanted to put this out that we must not take our eyes from this whole bigger structural interlinkages and analysis. And I forgot to start my stopwatch. I don't know how long do I have, but I think this is kind of what I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Tonny, for sharing that experience with us. Yeah, I think human-wildlife conflict and how we deal with that is a huge issue on many levels. And it makes clear how there always is various perspective and how important it is that we speak to people who are on the ground, and that we as conservationists are not perceived or do not even, worse than that, carry out actions which are detrimental to the local people who are living with the wildlife wherever it is. So another person who I'm really looking forward to give his perspective is hopefully now connected. He is a Maasai elder from northern Tanzania. I'm very happy to introduce Shomet. He has devoted his life to work among his people, being at the front line, mainly against land alienation for decades in the area of the Ngorongoro and Serengeti districts, where white people have taken away land from the Maasai, including by creating national parks like the Serengeti National Park, a problem which most of us, I hope, are aware of is a quite big one within conservation. Shomet has also done consultancy work around community-based network resource management, and he's now writing a book collecting decades of lived experiences and data in relation to biodiversity and conservation. He is also one of the co-founders of the Pan-African Living Cultures Alliance that has a vision of uniting indigenous people around the continent for their struggle for biodiversity conservation. I really hope that we have overcome the technical problems, and I would now really like to give the word to Shomet.
Thank you very much. I am very happy to get this opportunity to share with you some of my age-old experiences in the whole area of biodiversity conservation. Firstly, I would like to say that when you speak to a Maasai about conservation, it is very difficult for him to define conservation from the point of view of a Western perspective. For the Maasai, conservation is living with nature. Our whole life, our livelihood system, our natural resource management system is embedded in the conservation of biodiversity. For us, we depend on biodiversity for our livelihood. And we have to care about the environment, about the natural resources, because that is where we depend upon for our livelihood. So conservation for us is part of our culture. It is living, coexisting with nature, living with nature, and taking care of the nature, taking care of the resources, the forest, the grasses, and respecting the trees. Even when we cut the trees, you don't cut the whole tree if you need some part of it. You just cut part of it so that tomorrow the tree will let it go. So our understanding of conservation is actually very holistic. It is part of life. And we believe in order to be able to to exist, to live, to lead a healthy and successful life, you must have a very healthy environment. The Serengeti ecosystem is where I was born and why I'm still living in the Serengeti ecosystem. So, which is now one of the world famous conservation sanctuary in East Africa. The Maasai have taken care of that land all the ages before the British colonial government came into place, and they found a very well taken care of environment. They found a very harmonious coexistence between human beings and wildlife. They found a place where the Maasai could live side by side with wildlife without any conflict, without fighting. And for that reason, we have developed a relationship, a living relationship with the wildlife. We have even gone as far as giving animals, names of our clans. Each animal has a Maasai clan. That tells you about our understanding of the animal kingdom, of the animal life, of the environment, all right? So for us, conservation is about living with nature. It's about being part of the nature. It's about caring the nature. And it's not about commodification of the environment, of the animal, because for us, we wonder what is happening, because the whole question of Western development philosophy and perspective and embedded in the capitalism and consumerism actually has tremendously contributed to a very destructive understanding of natural resource management and biodiversity conservation. Because biodiversity conservation from the Western perspective is commodified. The environment is treated as a commodity which can be used to make money, but it's not treated as a conservation of a very, very important part of our planet, which is taking care of us and which we need in order to survive as humanity in our planet. So I have spent 32 years struggling against land alienation in my district. And this is because of the perspective of economic growth-oriented perspective of conservation. And I was one of the first founders of the first indigenous Maasai NGO in Tanzania and Kenya. And the first NGO which I started actually was called KIPAO, Korongoro Peoples Oriented to Conservation. I wanted that NGO to promote indigenous perspectives of conservation and try to make other people understand our own indigenous conservation perspective. And again, I have worked for many years, among the Maasai, because that's where my passion is, and I'm part of this community. I'm one of the few learned people who have come back after finishing graduating from university and working with my people. And what I have come to understand is we have lost so much land. We have lost so much very, very valuable land, and this has actually contributed. This has actually contributed. I'm sorry. And this and the amount of land we have lost actually has affected our livelihood system, and it has affected our conservation struggles of biodiversity. Because in the Serengeti ecosystem, the entire ecosystem has been compartmentalized. It has been parceled into slots, and given names: Game Controlled Area, Serengeti National Park, Ngorongoro Conservation Area Authority, Gurumeti Game Reserve, and what have you, which is a very compartmentalized perspective of biodiversity conservation. It is one ecosystem, and it should be treated as one ecosystem. And the health of the entire ecosystem should be treated as one entity and not put into parcels. And this perspective actually has contributed to antagonizing people against the conservation, pitting people against the conservation, against the wildlife. So again, recently we decided to start an organization which is called Pan-African Living Cultures Alliance. It is yet another struggle to unite indigenous people around biodiversity conservation, protection of our cultural rights, and the revamping of our culture, and trying to make the rest of the world understand our perspective and our definition and our understanding of biodiversity conservation, and being the source of hope for the planet, for the rest of the people in our planet, and contributing to the efforts to save the planet from extinction. And this organization actually focuses on biodiversity conservation, natural resource management from the perspectives of the indigenous people, and promoting the existing cultural harmony between the people and nature, because this is somehow being eroded by modern development processes and by economic growth-oriented development processes in our national states in Africa. And we hope by starting this organization, we will be able to inform policy formulation processes at the national level, at the regional level, and also to connect with the global struggle, global forces to save the planet from extinction by sharing our perspective and using the technologies which we have used for thousands of years to coexist with nature. So I hope my experiences and my sharing can somehow inform some of your perspectives as professional or learned conservationists who think of conservation as a very separate entity, a completely separate entity from human living system, as a commodified entity. So this is where we differ from Western professional conservationists. When we talk about conservation, Serengeti National Park, it is perceived as a money-making venture, where tourists come and the government makes money, and that is it. But that's not how we perceive actually nature, how we perceive conservation. Thank you. And also, in our organization, PALCA, we have decided to use what we call participatory video approach, enabling the indigenous people to become professionals in the use of modern technology, actually to record, to capture our own stories, so that we can tell the rest of the world about ourselves from our own point of view, rather than depending on people from outside to tell stories about ourselves. So we are working with some friends of the Maasai from the north, like Inside Share, on this, and Oxford Peace River Museum in Oxford University. We are working to develop the strategy for the operationalization of the PALCA strategy in Africa and linking with the North movement in order to promote biodiversity conservation and to save the planet together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shomet. I'm really happy that you managed to connect and tell us about your experience, and first and foremost, reminding us, as I assume a mainly European audience, which we usually have here, that indigenous people, as we all know, protect 80% of biodiversity around the globe, and that it's extremely important that the land rights are protected. And thank you again for sharing this experience. You also highlighted the difficulties to reunite in any meaningful way conservation and development. And our next speaker, who is currently a professor and chair of the Sociology of Development and Change Group at Wageningen University, is Bram Buscher. And he has been researching into this topic quite a bit. He has published over 85 articles in peer-reviewed journals, and he recently, with a co-author, Robert Fletcher, has written a book which is called The Conservation Revolution: Radical Ideas for Saving Nature Beyond the Anthropocene. And I'm very excited that he will tell us a bit about his research, how to unite or not to unite nature conservation, capitalism, and development, and how things potentially could be done differently in the future.
Great, thank you so much, Carola, and good evening to everybody, and thanks for the invitation. Well, I was very happy to see all the presentations, and these are quite hard to follow because I think many of the important points have already been said. I will share my screen for a couple of thoughts in relation to that book that you mentioned, Carola, the Convivial or the Conservation Revolution. But I won't try to really do any justice to what is in there, but highlight maybe just a couple of points to link with some of what the other speakers have been saying, and then perhaps provide a couple of other elements or issues that will be good for the discussion. So as you can see on this particular figure here, we've been inspired by many global movements, including degrowth and climate justice and others. And we'd like to see, you know, our project as sort of one sort of little stream in this broader, sort of broader flow of movements and this energy and these kind of alternatives, all seeking, you know, a transformative way out of the current growth paradigm and contemporary capitalist mess that we are all in. And to maybe start by sort of hammering home Iago's point, which I think he made very clear already, but to see why the growth imperative also requires a different form of conservation, I've put up this slide on what is called the Great Acceleration. So I'm not sure whether all of you can read all those different things on there. It's not really important, but I hope you can see that all these graphs on here sort of have the same type of trajectory, sort of strongly upward. So this idea of the Great Acceleration came up in discussions on sort of the current age of humans, the Anthropocene, and our, you know, the human sort of pressure on the planet. And it shows from the 1750s, 1800s, basically how things across socioeconomic trends and Earth system trends have grown tremendously. So besides GDP, you see fertilizer consumption here, paper production, telecommunications, transportation, etc. on the socioeconomic side. And on the Earth system side, you see things, all kinds of different things like tropical forest loss, shrimp agriculture, ocean acidification, carbon dioxide, obviously in relation to climate change, and many other trends. They're not all the same, but they all display in a certain way a very clear hockey stick type growth pattern. And if you compare that sort of to the main sort of proposal, the main sort of practical way in which conservation has been implemented over the last 100 to 150 years, you see exactly the same pattern. So this is a figure showing the increase in protected area size globally from about 1911 to 2011. So the green is the cumulative total terrestrial area under some form of protection. the blue, the cumulative total area for marine, and the red line is the total area of the globe under some form of protection. Now, there's a whole debate on whether that actually means that they're well protected. Many parks obviously are paper parks and are not well protected, and or don't meet either their social ecological goals. But let's for the sake of the argument here say that to a good degree they do. Then it's very interesting to note that we've seen this massive growth in protected areas, and the figure is actually quite similar to what you see here, which is generally sort of seen as the problem, right? The clear unsustainability of this kind of growth pattern. Now, if we see all these graphs, if they will continue growing as they have been, obviously some clearly on here have seen a significant drop. I mean, you see international tourism here as well, which has declined completely due to the Corona crisis. But if it will pick up again and start growing, this picture presents an idea of complete unsustainability. We can't keep growing like this. And apparently, if we look at conservation, and at least its main way of operationalizing conservation in protected areas, it hasn't hindered us from getting into the current sort of sixth extinction crisis or major biodiversity problem that we currently have. So that, for me at least, and I'm not going to repeat what Iago said, but adds to what he said in terms of how growth puts pressure on the environment, but also, and that's what this slide shows, how the growth of protected areas has not hindered us from getting into a major biodiversity problem as signaled last year by the IPBES report. Now, obviously within conservation, this is hotly debated. And what we try to do in the book is to sort of reflect on this. And we start with a very simple kind of graph, a very simple sort of depiction of the debate going on in conservation, and ask the question, or at least here, whether that sort of maybe gives a little bit of reason for hope in terms of where conservation is going and what its contribution could be. You see here two axes. The one is in relation to the nature-people dichotomy, and the other in relation to capitalism or growth vis-a-vis degrowth. And if you then look at the four quadrants that would appear, there are different sort of paradigms within conservation that you can name that fill these different quadrants. So we place mainstream conservation into the upper left corner, right? Main focus has always been on protected areas, separating people and nature in all kinds of ways. And the nature-people dichotomy is still really much underpinning of many conservation strategies, including many market-based strategies. Not illogical, because they're fully sort of embedded within the contemporary growth or capitalist paradigm. Now, this has seen a major challenge from a group that calls themselves New Conservation, that say we need to radically move beyond these nature-people dichotomies, to move beyond parks, to rethink what nature really means, to look more positively at invasive species, which is something that Iago also talked about. And so that was very controversial, of course. And to do away with wilderness and actually start focusing also on, and maybe especially on people. How? Namely by integrating conservation into political economy, but according to the contemporary sort of capitalist growth model. That in turn has seen a major response over the last, say, 7 to 8 years from a group that's been around for much longer and has also had a lot of impact on conservation discussions globally in the 1980s and 1990s, a group that we refer to as neo-protectionists. People who would like to sort of go back to the core of what conservation, according to them, should be all about, particularly around protected areas, and find ways to enlarge that. So their big project currently is either nature needs half or half Earth, 30% by 2030. There's a lot of slogans, but they all focus mainly around increasing the protected area estate. And At the same time, a group within this sort of paradigm have become increasingly critical of things like consumption and growth. And this is where we find a very interesting sort of connection with them. So what we try to do in the book is critically look at both of these axes, the relation between conservation and capitalism, the relation between the nature-people dichotomy and conservation, and how these different sort of ideas and paradigms fit into that, also their nuances and all that I can't get into now. And then actually sort of pick interesting elements from these two radical challenges to mainstream conservation and inspiration from lots of other movements that I showed in the beginning, in the first slide, and actually try to bring that together in an alternative degrowth conservation paradigm that we call convivial conservation. Now, there's clearly not enough time here to go into detail, but just to give you a taste of what we think convivial conservation is. Clearly, it is an intertwined strategy that goes beyond growth. So it's really situated squarely within the degrowth paradigm, and it tries to move beyond the nature-people dichotomy. And in fact, we argue that that's the only logical choice. To do the one without doing the other is completely illogical and actually would make either unrealistic. And that's also basically the conclusion that we have of these two other strategies. Again, as I said, we see this as one stream in a broader wave of movements, some of which you can see here. And we believe that the current crisis makes it even clearer that an alternative is needed now more than ever. So one of the things we try to do in the book is come up with an ideal for the long term, but I won't go into that here. I'll just very briefly in this last slide outline some of the more shorter term actions that we see that we feel are necessary to shift the political terrain, both the political terrain of conservation, but also the broader political terrain that conservation in all kinds of ways is quite powerful in. First, historic reparations, decolonizing conservation is really the sine qua non of any alternative. It must always start with doing justice to the people that have been marginalized through conservation, that have historically been dispossessed through conservation, and really sort of looking into the conservation movement itself, which is still incredibly wide, dominated by also often very disturbing ideas, particularly in relation also to population growth that often become quite to put it mildly, racially tinted, but maybe more realistically to become very racist, because then people start pointing at other places like outside of Europe, where I am here now, to say that people need less babies and that somehow will be good for biodiversity. Now I can go into a long diatribe about that. I won't be doing that. Rob Fletcher, my co-author, has written a lot about that, and I think Tonny would also have a lot to say about that, and others as well. Second is a thing we call conservation basic income. It's basically trying to move away from an economy around competition, international trade, etc., to an economy based on care and redistribution. It would also be a literal sort of redistributive kind of mechanism to allow people to live decent lives as part of a broader sort of universal basic income strategy, and in order to somehow connect different classes of people around the world. So that's why this other little figure is up here, and I think this again would fit quite well with what Tonny was saying about that we need a more structural understanding of the system and not blame poor people in all kinds of ways for particular things that happen either to elephants or anything else. Right? So what you see here very schematically are different kind of global classes, and often the lower rural classes are asked to change their lives for conservation, so that upper classes and middle classes can travel to these places and enjoy pretty wildlife. We actually say no, they need to be fully in control, the people that live with biodiversity, in many ways, but they shouldn't be held responsible for conservation. And we should tie impacts also on biodiversity to these upper classes, land-owning classes and middle income classes. Thirdly, for conservation, they need to drastically rethink their relations with corporations, right? Big conservation is in bed with big corporations and big state. And we think that that's completely a failing strategy. They rather should be focusing on countervailing power, and or they can work with corporations, but only if these corporations would sign up to a degrowth manifesto. Fourthly, work together in a convivial conservation coalition, and maybe more immediate actions, fifthly, to really redirect landscapes to become more mixed on the one hand, really living with nature. And here I think I've really been inspired by Shomet's talk, saying that we need to look at landscapes holistically, and conservation should be about living with nature, right? And that's also where convivial obviously comes from. Other forms of governance, more democratic, and different forms of finance focused around redistribution. All right, I will leave it at that. I am through my time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bram, for explaining some of the background controversies around capitalism and conservation, and showing some ideas, suggestions for the future. I would like to encourage the audience to post some questions in the YouTube chat. We have already collected a few, but now is your time that we have heard all the inputs, that you could ask your questions, which I will then put to the panel. So please just use the opportunity to ask what you would like to know. So one of the questions, I'm going to ask only one of my own questions, which is, how could the degrowth movement link better to nature conservation in general, and how could it be supportive of people on the ground? The degrowth movement, as we all know, is still mainly rooted in the global north. So how could degrowth activists actually really come to the support of people on the front lines? Anyone of the panel who would like to answer that, yeah, please just go ahead or raise your hand so you can speak.
Yeah. Can I go ahead?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, maybe I can answer the first question from the research point of view. So researchers that are interested in degrowth studies, how can they better link with nature conservation? We have suggested some of the policy proposals of these studies that might be good for biodiversity, like, for example, caps or agroecology or work sharing. But we don't really know if these policies are going to have a good impact or not, under what conditions. So this is ground for research and also activism that can actually inform us better about whether these policies have the effect on biodiversity that we want or not, how, under which conditions, which alliances, and so on.
Shomet or Tonny, would you maybe have any ideas how the degrowth movement could support people on the front lines of biodiversity conservation?
I could quickly add, just maybe, I mean, in terms of a movement, degrowth is still shaping, and also in the last Vienna Degrowth Conference, what we stressed more and more, that there's a lot to learn for degrowth from the communities on the front line, the people who are at the front lines of the extractivism. And as I said, because of, as I haven't encountered a lot of discussion in the biodiversity area, but as from my, how to say, like a from a distant knowledge, as in many kind of under the capitalistic conservation area, there is also the communities that are marginalized. We could also consider that as a frontline in terms of where people are kind of trying to have right over lands. So it's more, I think one thing that we are trying to do, emphasize more and more to really turn around this whole colonial idea of helping whenever there's a movement somewhere in global north, and then kind of helping or amplifying, but rather kind of learning how to take from these communities what can be learned and then taken up. That's one, I think that's already we're trying to enforce more and more to fundamentally change, because when we what Bram also was sharing in his presentation, if we are really wanting to move towards a convivial conservation, that would also mean we would need to learn a lot from exactly when Shomet was sharing his experiences of the communities that are really living with nature and have a lot of preserved knowledge. But at the same time, this I've also emphasized many times in the past, but again, to not romanticize it, not to romanticize indigenous way of living or the communities that are marginalized and fighting, but really kind of learning from their struggle, and at the same time to know how we can really change our this way of living that takes up so much space in this planet, and how we move towards there. So I think it's going to be like a both-way learning relationship with the communities and kind of shaping it together. That's mine, yeah.
Yeah, anyone else who would like to speak to that question? If not, I will.
Didn't Shomet?
Shomet, would you like to say something?
It seems he's frozen.
Yeah, it seems he's frozen, unfortunately.
I can say maybe a little bit until Shomet comes back online. And then, I can see Shomet
Yeah,
again.
yeah. Shomet, do you want to speak? We can't unfortunately hear him anymore, and he possibly cannot hear us neither, which is a real shame. Okay, we see if we can sort out this issue which we had previously in the talk, and I would maybe just give Bram the word for the moment.
Well, so I think, I mean, one of the things that Shomet said was about the idea of looking at it holistically. Now I hear Shomet. Shomet, can you hear us?
Microphone is muted.
We can hear you now.
Microphone is
So one thing we've been working on is a thing called conservation impact chains, is to try to, and I think this is where the degrowth movement can also help, is to really sort of from two different angles, either starting from an ecosystem and or species, etc., or maybe from a particular group of people, particularly those with a larger sort of footprint, and to connect that to particular resources in order to really politicize resource use. So basically to politicize the chain that Iago is also shown in his presentation, right? To not sort of like, and I think this is what Tonny was just saying as well, to not only put the pressure on local people, but to make them part of a broader conversation, learn from other ways of doing, whilst obviously not romanticizing this, but to connect different ways of life and how they impact on biodiversity, and to try to really sort of push for change where it's needed the most. So either big corporations or indeed global consuming classes, etc., not by promoting or talking to them as consumers, because I think that that's very limited, but by actually, you know, talking to them as citizens and as political actors who in all kinds of ways, right, coming back to the idea of holism, in all kinds of ways can try to make a difference, right, both through how they live and how they consume, but also in how they present nature, how they travel, how they, you know, what kind of natures they support, right, from very spectacular type of, you know, mega productions that are so far-fetched, you know, far removed from actual, you know, on the ground, more mundane, everyday type of natures and situations. So I think that there's a lot that different, you know, folks within degrowth can do besides doing what they're already doing, namely pushing for degrowth. Carola? Now it seems we've lost you as well. Slowly, we're losing all the speakers. Tonny, you'll be the only one left in 10 minutes from now.
We are supposed to be ending probably in 10 minutes from now.
Is the only one left because there's many questions for Tonny. But first of all, I would just put the first question from the audience forward, which was basically saying that the IPBES report, the big biodiversity report from last year, was calling for a transition in all sectors, and still challenging growth is still not clearly integrated in the conservation for biological diversity framework post-2020. So the question is, if you would have any strategic advice for activists and scientists to keep degrowth on the agenda? Activists.
I can give a try to that one. Can you hear me?
I need manage silent.
I can hear you.
Okay. I didn't hear Carola's question very well, but one of the moderators sent it via the chat. It's a question about IPBES and the call for a transition in all sectors of the economy, which is not yet very clearly integrated in the post-2020 framework. For those of you who are not familiar with these terms, we are talking about the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is an international convention signed by different countries of the world, which goal is to stop biodiversity loss, and IPBES is informing that convention via scenarios and studies and so on. And the post-2020 framework refers to the new set of rules or goals, better, for biodiversity in the next decade. In the last decade, we had something called the Aichi targets, which were specific goals and targets for biodiversity for the decade. And now the states of the Convention of Biological Diversity are discussing the post-2020 framework. This means new goals for biodiversity protection at the international level. For example, can we have something similar to the common goal of 1.5 degree warming as with the Convention on Climate Change? It was agreed in Paris meeting, right? Can we have something similar for that, to that for biodiversity? Which indicators do we need to use? How can we mainstream biodiversity conservation across all the sectors of the economy? All this is going to be discussed in the next years. In theory, it was going to be discussed in the COP, the Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity. This year, it was going to be held in China, but I think it has been cancelled because of the pandemics. So it will have to be postponed. But in any case, this is a discussion that is going to start, or is starting already. And it's a very good question. How can we actually make sure that these ideas, that the critical appraisal of economic growth is present in those talks? I think that by lobbying, by making reports based on sound research, by putting together different alternatives, as some of the alternatives that have been discussed here, in different calls for content that there have been already, or there might be in the future. For example, we are thinking in putting together a report based on the main conclusions of our paper to be discussed in these meetings at the international level. So I think there is a lot that can be done there, both from the scientific point of view and also from the activist point of view, and from the point of view of different organizations that are pushing for different ideas on conservation.
Maybe just to add to that, to what Iago says, we've been working with the Dutch Environmental Planning Bureau on exactly this, on making, on doing several post-2020 sort of scenario analysis. And one is based on what they call a shared planet or convivial conservation kind of ID. And for people who are interested, please do get in touch, either over email or so. They will send out or produce a booklet on this very soon, and hopefully that'll also be part of and directly integrated into the talks for the CBD COP, which of course was supposed to be held in October. Sorry, the Convention on Global Biodiversity Conference of Parties, the big conference which was supposed to be held in China in October, but has now been postponed. So that will be an important global meeting happening sometime next year. But also the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, they have their World Conservation Congress, was supposed to be held around this time in June, but that has been postponed to January. So these are two really good fora to push for and let these kind of voices be heard.
All right. Hi, everyone. And sorry, we are having a lot of technical issues. I think Carola is disconnected and probably Shomet as well. So I'm going to jump in. I'm Lorenzo. I was doing the technical part of the moderation, but I will proceed to ask the next questions from the audience to the speakers who are left. I hope Tonny is here as well. And I'm really, yes, she is, thank you. And I'm really sorry for all these issues, and thanks. And I thank the audience for their patience. The next question we had from the audience was, what do you say to eco-modernist conservationists who argue that intensifying agriculture, energy, and human settlement will spare land for nature? And another one, perhaps that can be attached to it, is many global South national governments are on neo-colonial development trajectories, extraction for growth. How do we decolonize conservation without reproducing past unequal relations? Feel free to answer one of them or both. I don't know who is keen to go forward. Iago, yes.
Maybe I can just quickly answer the one on sparing land for nature, with a concentration of activities, very efficient activities in one area, so that then we can save land for nature in the rest of areas, right? There has been a long debate now in science and conservationists about whether it's better to share land between different uses or to spare land between one use and the other, right? So I think that the two approaches might not necessarily be incompatible. It's a good idea eventually to concentrate productive activities in some areas to spare some land for nature in others, but we should always be aware also that there might be some leakage effects, meaning that if you protect or concentrate a lot your activity in one area, there might be some activity that goes to different countries and creates impacts there where, for example, the legislation is less strict. So all this has to be taken into account, and probably there might be different combinations of strategies that are relevant for different contexts. So eventually, in some contexts, sparing land might be a sound strategy as long as it is done with respect for the people. And in some other countries or contexts, sharing between different uses might be the best strategy.
Does anyone else want to add something to this?
Were you going to? I just want to also ask, could you repeat this, because you asked two questions back to back, is it possible to, because I remember I had a response, but then I also quickly lost it.
Yes, sorry, I've been not sure. It was, I can't find it anymore, has been deleted from where it was, but it was about Global South governments pushing for eco-modernist growth-driven agendas for conservation, and how can these agendas be decolonized? I think this was the question. Yes, sorry, I have it here. Many Global South national governments are on neo-colonial development trajectories, extraction for growth. So how do we decolonize conservation without reproducing past unequal relations?
I mean, for that, this is also, I think, like continuous, how I see in terms of the strategy or the degrowth. For a lot, the movement also for degrowth, me coming from Bangladesh, why am I part of this or what it means? It comes to the fact that a lot of the relationships or the global structure that is fundamentally stratified, or we are embedded in a kind of like a local, like a center and periphery relationship. And if we consider or take it as to be true, then a lot of decolonization, so degrowth fundamentally also means that kind of reversing this this way of accumulation, how the resources are being accumulated or needs to be processed through a certain upward production chain. And within that structure, if we think of how the regional global south countries, so because this is the only way for countries, when you're embedded in this structure, you could only grow unless, like, if you are also fitting into it, producing something that is in demand or follow the same way of economic production. So on one hand, and this is also, of course, again, still theoretical in a way that philosophically, this is the core, or how I believe that, of course, one thing when we talk about degrowth, we also need to slow down at the way we live, so that it's not only about growth or moving away from growth, but also kind of thinking about the metabolism of our economies and starting to think in terms of our economy as well, like how the speed in which we are taking resources from the nature, and to what extent nature can reproduce it, and how we are producing to move into a balance with that, slowing down. And this is probably a lot would need to be then done for the countries in global south if they want to. Now we know it's very difficult to have a separate growth strategy, or a separate, not growth strategy, but even an economics to live, to provide for people in their of those countries. So, and it is going to be probably complicated. So I'm just reflecting on this parts that we look at Cuba of, again, not to romanticize it, there are so many problems that as an economy, as a country it has, but within this, during this Corona crisis, we also saw how the fact that they heavily invested in health and education and agriculture supported the country in a different way, where this small country, which has been under heavy lockdown, trade sanction, could even provide to send their health professionals to big countries that are kind of leaders or economic leaders globally. So this helps us to see things in perspective. And I'm just saying this is, of course, I don't have an answer, but I'm just saying this could be the way of thinking or looking at it or following a thought. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We'll pose now a long question that came our way for whoever feels like answering. It says, to counter conservation's role in the hegemonic imposition of colonial and capitalist ideologies and the marginalization of alternative, usually traditional or indigenous ways of life, do you think that critical conservation scholarship like Bram's one, should be prioritizing direct conversation with indigenous voices and radically different knowledges beyond the confines of academia? I don't know if Bram wants to answer this directly, and maybe after also Shomet could say something about this.
Yeah, I think this is a good question. But a couple of things maybe in the question that I'm not 100% clear about. I mean, prioritizing direct conversation with indigenous voices sort of sounds like critical conservation scholarship and or knowledges are about this one particular sort of conversation. And I personally think that many different conversations and many different voices need to be had and need to be heard. So if this would mean, yeah, that critical conservation scholarship learns from and converses with indigenous voices, yeah, I think that is absolutely critical. I think also that it's very important that indigenous voices are heard, and they need to be so much more than they are currently. I do think in this particular world that we are in, that different forms of knowledge can and indeed do coexist next to each other, and that different ways of trying to maybe make a similar kind of political statement or argument could actually work together quite well. So I would reframe the question a little bit, rather than saying that it's only about a particular conversation that needs to be had. It's also about a political sort of form of political organizing that needs to be done, whereby different voices can be heard in different forms, and different knowledges may complement each other. Right, in the global arena that we were also just talking about previously at the conventional global biodiversity, also there, people have tried to bring in other kind of voices, but they're often distorted in how they get into policy, of course, which is sometimes much more technical or instrumental or more bureaucratic, etc., or legal even, and those kind of forms of knowledge can play a role if they're quite different, so that they can support indigenous knowledge, but currently I think mostly they don't. And so that's the way I think I would reframe the question.
Thank you. I think Shomet is now able to hear us again. I suspect. Are you there, Shomet? Can you hear us?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Thank you, great. I would just like to ask, and I also see Carola is back. I'm glad everyone is back. I'll just ask this last question from my side, and then I'll hand it over to Carola again. Connecting what I just asked to Bram and Bram's answer, there is also another question from the audience that's related and was specifically asked for you, Shomet. That is, do you have any thoughts about those in the West or global North using indigenous knowledge to inform our own conservation practices? And if so, how to do this ethically and respectfully? You can give your perspective on this answer and the previous one.
Yes, I think at the issue here is the whole question of the North or the Western actually professionals. They need to actually complement their knowledge of conservation by understanding the indigenous conservation thinking, philosophies, strategies, and technologies. Because I think where we have gone wrong is where we actually completely marginalized the knowledge of indigenous people on biodiversity conservation in the thinking that the indigenous people knew nothing, or at worst are enemies of conservation. This is why we are being evicted from key prime lands in various parts of the world, not only in Africa, in the South Hemisphere. So I think the most important thing is the Northern or the Western professionals should be ready to listen to the voices of the indigenous people on biodiversity conservation. What do we say? How do we define conservation? How can we share practical experiences of a harmonious and peaceful coexistence with nature? So I think this is key in order to understand each other and for both the indigenous people to inform Western professionals and Western professionals to inform indigenous knowledge. Because inevitably, we need to bring the two. We need an interface between both the Western professional knowledge on conservation and the indigenous professional knowledge on conservation. I think this is the key. How do we interface? Where do we meet? And this is why I came up with the idea of facilitating the establishment of a Pan-African entity, hoping that this is going to create a space where professionals from the West can meet with the indigenous people and dialogue around issues of conservation.
Thank you, Shomet.
That's what I think. Yes.
If Carola is back, I'll leave the end of the conversation to her.
Yes.
Yes, there you are.
Yeah, thank you, Lorenzo, for taking over. I hope I'm back. I don't know if people can quickly tell me if they can hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, apologies. I don't know what was the reason. Yeah, maybe one or two more questions because we still have a few. So someone in the audience was asking if you would know examples of eco-land banking, buying up small parcels of land to prevent mass development, which would then be held in community trusts. Have you heard of such initiatives, and how do you view them?
I think that could be a good idea, depending on who buys the land and who is in whose control that land is gonna be, and what are the forces which will have the mandate to make decision around the utilization of resources in that land. Because actually the control system always is the issue. You know, you can set a piece of land for conservation, but who controls, you know, the management of that land? Because in many cases, once such a parcel of land is set aside, it is actually separated from the people, you know, around the area, and finally, people are not a part of the whole process, and they become antagonized against you know, the good intentions of conserving that piece of land. So it really depends on who's gonna control the management, who's gonna control access and use of resources within that land. Otherwise, that would be a good idea.
Anyone else who would like to speak to that or has any experience with it?
Let me ask you a question. Is this something which has been practically done, or is this an idea in the offing? Is this something which has happened actually, or this a strategy which is in the process of being developed?
I think it's something which has happened in very few local cases of local communities, and I think the question was whether it would make sense to expand it on a larger level. But I think I will move on to the next question. I think make it two more questions and I would close, because I think the audience as well might be at the limits. So is my computer battery actually as well, apart from my internet connection, which we now know is awful. Yes. So I will choose just two more questions. So there was a question particularly from people in the global north, which is how could degrowth or activist communities, be it Fridays for Future or the Extinction Rebellion, put pressure on large conservation organizations? And how could we kind of stop the violence they do to local communities? We know there are some pretty bad examples of big conservation organizations, and how could we, how could these activist communities put pressure into this direction?
I think many of these big international conservation organizations are very powerful. For example, the Frankfurt Zoological Society, which actually spearheaded the establishment of the Serengeti National Park. It is a very powerful organization here in Tanzania. So they have a lot of influence. The UNESCO, you know, which has inscribed the Ngorongoro conservation as a World Heritage Site, and minus, you know, the people who are living in the area. We have to to dialogue with them, or how to pressurize them to include their cultural values in the inscription of the area. So I think what we can do is, many a time this organization do have their own philosophies about conservation and very fixed the frameworks, and compartmentalize the thinking. And they don't want to move away from these boxes. They want to safely stay in these boxes. Like, for example, in the Serengeti, I started a process whereby communities who are living in the adjacent areas in the Serengeti could come together and talk with the Frankfurt Zoological Society and tell them that, as a matter of fact, you are moving in the wrong direction. If you are talking about maintaining the health in the Serengeti ecosystem, we are talking about people living in the Serengeti ecosystem should actually be part of the strategy, the greater strategy for the conservation of the area. And by so doing, they should tangibly benefit from the conservation efforts in the Serengeti ecosystem. It is not viable anymore to continue to fix their eyes and their hearts and their minds on conserving wildlife in the Serengeti in a very traditional way, which actually antagonizes people against conservation, because that is against conservation. If you don't conserve with the people, you are going against conservation. So I think we need to dialogue with this organization. We need to share our perspectives. We need to create a space where we can interact with these organizations, because many a times they meet, they have their consortiums, they meet among themselves, they have big meetings, global meetings annually, and they meet, they talk big time about the work they do. And they measure the success of the work by measuring how far have they gone in meeting their conservation targets. So I think we need to inform them. We need to educate them, about, alternative strategies of conserving without antagonizing the people around the area, because that's going against conservation. So that's what I think.
Okay, thank you very much, Shomet. I think, looking at the time, I would like to ask each one from the panel to make a final statement, maybe what is their takeaway from the chat we had about the connection of degrowth and nature conservation. So I would like to hear from the others what they take away from this meeting we are just having. Who would like to go first on that one?
Yeah,
Tonny looks like she would like to speak. Right? Yeah, please.
Yeah, but I didn't want to also interrupt Shomet. I think you just, he wanted to say something still, or?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one very important takeaway from this meeting is this is a very good strategy of sharing information, sharing knowledge, sharing experiences from professionals, from indigenous people, and through interfacing like this, we inform one another on different possibilities in discussing around issues around conservation, and how we can share knowledge, from both ends, from the indigenous people perspectives and from the professional perspectives, in order to consolidate our understanding, consolidate our knowledge and experiences on actually issues of biodiversity conservation.
Okay, then I'll get on with Tonny, please.
Yes. I also wanted to pick up quickly also, because I liked the last question. It had more practical implications. So kind of a takeaway I could think, not personally, but I also want to put out this idea that, again, looking at this, that in global north, of course, there are certain powers, and many of these big conservation organizations have their head offices. And also, because before we have probably never talked, or this is not still present so much in the discussion of their colonial approaches or attitudes. And if really XR or FFF, and there are some strands who would really want to start a movement taking up this issue, it could be, yeah, it could be useful to start thinking in this way. It could be, one thing could be specifically engaging with what Shomet was saying, like this organization that are they're trying to put for this discussion to start open up like a specific policy discussion, like what kind of policy change that we can specifically ask from this big conservation who has a lot of power, who are also very how to say, like protected in their white way of thinking and well-established thinking, and really think in terms of campaign terms, launching, because of course they are not expecting attack from environmentalist other groups, right? And this is not still, that would be something new to start even to really bring into this whole decolonial perspective into the discussion, and pointing a finger like, you're doing great, but there is a problem and that's not actually so great. That could be really a way of starting to think, and this way to really then, now that we have links, as so much said, like through this talk, now we really have link with the people on the ground, and really then connecting and start approaching it in exactly the similar way we are targeting now the banks, the big corporates. And this could be exactly not similar, but could be a closer way to really push forward discussion, opening up discussion, and for policy changes. I think that could be a good way forward from this discussion.
Thank you, Tonny. Yeah, Bram or Iago, do you have any final words? Any final takeaways from the session?
My takeaway is very, very brief. I think within these organizations, there are actually a lot of people.
Yeah, maybe I can just finish by saying that.
I think there's some delay.
Yeah, let's go Bram first and then Iago, please.
Like I said, very briefly, I think in a lot of these organizations, there are a lot of people who feel an enormous pressure, right? Because of the pressure that biodiversity is under, the sixth extinction crisis and all this, but also on the social side. But they work within very constrained institutional frameworks. And I think it's important to feed people more critical ideas, more radical ideas, meaning going to the roots, and different ideas, right? And to connect with them to try to help them also change these organizations from the inside.
Okay, thank you. Then it's time for Iago, I think. Iago, would you like to say some final words?
He's frozen.
Okay, well then I would like to take the opportunity to thank everyone for attending this talk. Apologies for the technical difficulties. I hope it has been informative for all the participants. I'm very thankful for everyone that you have made time, and I hope that after some dwelling on all the sides and all the different aspects of the topic which we heard today, we can actually go further and see and come up with different ideas how we can practically do something in the future and not leave it here at this talking stage. And I would be really looking forward to see a stronger connection between degrowth and the conservation movements of the future, which hopefully might look quite different from what they're looking like now. Yeah, so if Iago is not back, Iago, are you back? Well, I guess he isn't, so it seems that that's it. Thank you so much for attending, everybody. And have a great evening. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
Thank you, everybody.